Arise, arise, riders of Theoden! Fell leads awake fire and slaughter. Spear shall be shaken, shield be splintered, sword day, red day, ere the sun rises. Ride now, ride to Gondor!
This quote is taken from The Lord of the Rings, Chapter 5 of the first book of The Return of the King, when Theoden calls out to his men, espousing a great, if short, variant of a poem taken from the Poetic Edda, altered by Professor Tolkien. In many ways, it is the high point of a grand age of literature, and of perhaps the grandest of all genres. No other genre in the modern age has filled people with more longing, wistfulness, despair, hope, and love, and countless other emotions than this one genre. It is a grander genre, to be sure, with higher stakes and infinitely more depth than any other. It is a genre that reflects the nature of life, the tragedies of history, hope for the future, despair at what has been lost, and yet that has always succeeded in giving men and women of all ages the finest of examples to strive towards, to aspire to, and to relate to in some cases. It is a flawless genre in some ways, a genre that harkens back to an age undreamed of, an age of glory, of war, of valor, of honor, barbarism, and most of all, heroism. A genre that has always spoken to the very heart of what it means to be human. It is a genre with the finest of villains, the most devious and cruel of tyrants, the most disappointing of figures, and yet the most inspiring tales of redemption, hope, and goodness. And it all began with the mythic, or golden age of fantasy. It was a time of myth-making, when writers such as Lord Dunsany, Robert Irwin Howard, Walter Disney, and John Ronald Reuel Tolkien flourished, living about the same time as one another, and creating mythologies and stories cut in the mold of the likes of the Norse sagas, Greek tragedies, medieval tales, and epics of old. They all achieved greatness in their own way. None of them knew it, though, but they were in effect planting the seeds for a future genre that was to grow and flourish and become greater than any other in the West. The first of these men to try his hand did so with the goal of creating rather more folkloric fairy stories that are different from those of Howard and Tolkien, as they are from those that followed after them, where the other two created national epics for Texas and England respectively. Dunsany wrote stories that seem to have more in common at first glance with those of the brothers Grimm and Perrault. That said, his stories belong no less to the realm of myth-making than those of his two major successors. Born in the year 1876, on July 24th, and passing away in 1957 on October 25th, he was to be influenced by the very fairy tale writers of whom I made reference, along with others. He was the first to undertake the noble and unusual literary work of pioneering the new genre over the course of a long and very respectable career. His story of The Sword of Welleran, King of Elfland's Daughter, and many others remain popular to this very day, and though I've yet to read them, I will, never fear. I've heard nothing but good things about them. The next great myth maker needs no introduction, as in many ways, the story of the genre is the story of his greatest character, Conan, the Cimmerian. Conan, though, was not created in a vacuum. An expert on anthropology, Robert E. Howard was born in the year 1906, and was thus writing in the prime of his youth by the 1920s and 30s. His first jab at creating myth was the legendary Kull the King, or Kull of Atlantis, or Kull of the Thurian Age. Dissatisfied with the character after writing him for some time, Howard cast the Atlantean aside in order to create a number of other characters, but none more marked or important as Conan. Conan stole the hearts of many, and it was he who starred in the first great mythological national epic in several centuries. The Hour of the Dragon was arguably the finest novel of the 1930s. Finer than The Hobbit, and greater than any other volume produced in the 30s. In the popular imagination, it has mostly been wiped away, and yet it stands tall as the only book that merits being placed in the same league as Lord of the Rings. It was not that Auer was a Lord of the Rings slayer, but rather that the Lord of the Rings was the Hour of the Dragon Slayer. The book, though not an initial success, was to be re-released several times in the decades that followed, and was to grow ever more successful over the course of these decades. It is not of Howard, though, that most think of when they call back to the Golden Age, but rather to Tolkien. The good professor was author, as all know, of The Hobbit in 1937, then spent the 40s working tirelessly upon his epic novel, Lord of the Rings, one with the exact same plot as Hour of the Dragon, with a few details changed, and minus Conan. This in spite of the fact that Tolkien had never read The Hour of the Dragon. Lord of the Rings was the true harbinger of a new genre, spawning countless imitators and copycats, some good, others bad. That said, Lord of the Rings was arguably not Tolkien's magnum opus, but the Silmarillion was, easily the most finely written and edited work of the 20th century, published posthumously by the good professor's son, Christopher, who continued to search his father's archives for more writings in order to publish even more novel epics of the mythic age of fantasy literature. There simply aren't enough words in the English dictionary or any other language known to man to praise Tolkien enough for his great epic, or his son for having dedicated his life to his father's great works. Cinematically, the mythic age could also be called the Age of Walt, for it was during this era that Walt Disney, that great enterprising hero of American history in animation filmmaking, hero to my own mentor, Don Bluth, created his magnificent and flawless masterpieces, Snow White, Bambi, and Cinderella. Born in 1901, Walter Disney was to suffer failure after World War I in his attempts to break even with his animation. Arguably, it was his magnum opus and greatest commercial success that bankrolled him to well-deserved success, at long last, Snow White. Afterwards, he made movies such as Fantasia, a masterpiece of a film incomparable in its glorification of music. Walt then went on to create many a Disney shorts, each one charming and gloriously made, followed by Dumbo and Bambi, the latter which holds a special place in my heart. But to traditional fantasy, Walt added another great gemstone to his magnificent imperial crown, Cinderella, a masterpiece which cannot be recommended enough, and that still resonates to this very day. It must be stated that Walt's stories feel rather more targeted to girls, where Howard's, for example, are more for boys. This is natural. And yet, there's a timelessness to Walt's tales, a love and a faith that even boys could appreciate, and have across multiple generations. Walt and his brother Ron, who helped to forge the Disney Corporation, were less concerned with creating a grand sweeping legendarium all tied in together, and more interested, it seemed, in creating a cinematic series of fairy tales. His stories were grand, the art used in them incredible, and his vision awe-inspiring. Frankly speaking, in my view, only Don has surpassed him in these qualities, but on that front, I'm biased. But in the tapestry of the history of fantasy, Walt merits his place as a forebearer of the genre, alongside Dunsany, Howard, and Tolkien. But alas, in time, Walt stepped away from supervising animation himself to focus on other aspects of his business. This was natural, and he had other dreams, with the 9 old men of Disney coming in to supervise, rather more than him, the production of future animated Disney films. Walt Disney was to pass away in 1966, having given more to the genre than one can imagine, and having done so with earnest love and passion for animation, film, and children, instilling in them the knowledge that they could dream, they could hope for much more than life would have them dream of and do with their lives. The mythic age was not to last, as you all know, for though Lord of the Rings was published in the early to mid-1950s, the Silver Age began just as the Golden was coming to a close, so that there's a brief overlap between them. Though much of Tolkien's work was published posthumously, it belongs to the era prior to the Silver Age, due entirely to his having written most of it before, and to his continuing to write in the mode of the Golden Age, an age that used more Victorian English, used medieval literary devices, and followed in those traditions and tropes, rather more than any modern ones. It was an age of experimentation, development, and birth. unlike any other for any other genre. For within the fantasy genre, thanks to Tolkien and even Howard, it was to comprise within it all other genres, saving perhaps sci-fi. What started the next age, you may ask? Arguably, it was Lewis, the great friend of Tolkien. He was really the one who jump-started with his highly allegorical first tale of Narnia. This was the herald of what fantasy would morph into, and began the process of metamorphosing it from something more medieval and Victorian into something rather more modern. This in spite of Lewis himself hardly being all that fond of modernity, with the Silver Age beginning rather inauspiciously, yet managing to leave its indelible mark upon the genre, so that there's very little of the mythic left, as writers preferred to imitate Lewis and his heirs rather than Tolkien and Howard directly. A grave error in literary history, if I may say so. This is but the first in the history of fantasy series, and if you have enjoyed it thus far, do remember to smash that like button and to subscribe, and also to comment. But not only to this channel, but also to those of the brothers Arda and brothers Hiborian, if you like Tolkien and Howard respectively, as they are rather more focused channels where those two figures are concerned.
For the deeds of a man, not the words of a prophecy, are what shape his destiny. Lloyd Alexander, the High King. In the beginning there were 4 great visionaries, each one more brilliant than their forebears, and of a creative mind that might well have defined a century or era, but for 4 such to have been born in the same age was a boon beyond comprehension. Humanity was truly blessed, especially the Anglosphere, to have had so many great and brilliant men all alive in the same period. To say that they were unsurpassed is to state the very most obvious of facts. Let it be made clear, though, that while the next generation of fantasy writers were brilliant, none of them equaled or came close to matching the brilliance of their forebears. Thus, it was that we moved from an era of golden, unrivaled literature to a lesser era of far less skill in prose, lesser vision, and to an era of lesser creativity. The writers who came after these men were not untalented, though. Not all of them, at least. Some were, but not all. Lewis started off well with his Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. It was fitting that it should be he who started the Silver Age with the Chosen One type of prophecy that never really featured so blatantly in his predecessor's literature, but that he managed to make work. He focused his story on 4 children and their coming of age, in what was a fantastic tale against evil, which warns of dystopia and madness in a land that has lost its virtue but hungers to regain it in Narnia. But the truth is that while the first volume captured lightning in a bottle, the next several volumes, while financial success, were poorly written, evidently first drafts and dull stuff barely more readable and enjoyable than chicken scratches, if we're being honest. This in spite of the stellar cast of characters Lewis had invented in the first book. But while the Silver Age started off uncertainly, Lewis was soon joined by a great many other writers in deciding to tackle the genre. Too many really to count, but most noteworthy amongst them were Lloyd Alexander. Alexander was someone who had served in World War II and who had fallen in love in Paris. It was when he was stationed in Wales during the war that he had been introduced, though, to Welsh mythology, scenery, and historic locations. Though at first he struggled after the war to make ends meet, Alexander was to meet with remarkable and very well-deserved success. While T.H. White, who belongs to the Mythic Age, and who was writing Arthuriana during this time rather than fantasy, for there is a difference between the two. Rather than following in White's footsteps to directly adapt older mythical tales, Alexander preferred to chart his own course and intermingle his own ideas with the Celtic lore he had learned. The first of the stories to be published was in 1964 and was called The Book of Three. The story was a simple one about a youth by the name of Terran, who longs to be a hero, and who gets his chance when the prophetic pig he is in charge of flees into the forest. The story is fanciful, and the subsequent stories were to prove no less popular, and were to, like Narnia before, it charmed a whole generation of children. Alexander was to write Prydain throughout the 60s, and was to use this to launch a lifelong career as a writer. They are his main contribution to the genre, and for this he deserves considerable respect, just as Lewis does for one major element. Both of them sought to add a Celtic element to fantasy, putting it in front and center when it was but mere background before in the Conan stories, for example. And speaking of Conan, he made his return in 1950 with republication of The Hour of the Dragon, or as it was redubbed, Conan the Conqueror. Next came in 1952, The Sword of Conan, then with The Coming of Conan in 1953. The same year also saw King Conan. After it came the Conan the Barbarian, The Coming of Conan in 1953. The same year also saw King Conan, the Conan the Barbarian in 1954. Tales of Conan in 1955 and Return of Conan in 1957 all followed also. Most of these were highly edited versions of Howard's and thus not of the same quality that he had put out. The Conan stories were to be published throughout the 60s and 70s, with the next volumes published by Lancer, and were to see Deccan partner up with Lynn Carter for them. These pastiche novels that they wrote were of varying quality. Some were great, others were barely worth the paper they were printed on. But one thing cannot be denied: Conan had returned, and though it was not Robert E. Howard's Conan, he loomed large still throughout the Silver Age. This Conan, though not the towering genius of the Howard stories in some volumes, could still be fun, though the intelligence, as said, was dearly missed. Still, there were moments when he could be discerned. This run lasted until 1977, and was not without challengers, as Carl Edwards Wagner, who disliked the changes by Deccan and Carter, sought in 1977 to restore Howard's Conan. His attempts only lasted for 3 volumes. There was of course Donald Grant, who came out with his own editions from 1974 through to 1989, with the series culminating in the 1989 re-release of The Hour of the Dragon, which was properly titled, rather than the 1950 name, Conan the Conqueror. Bantam had its own series, one that lasted from 78 to 82, with Ace Maroto also publishing Conan stories during this time from 78 to 81. This wasn't the only way that Conan dominated the fantasy sphere, for in 1970, some schmuck from this comic book company you might have heard of went and begged for the rights to Conan. The stories in question were to prove incredibly popular and was to define Conan for a whole generation of children. With the 2 runs of Conan, one was to go through a whole series of titles, but the most notable one was Conan the Barbarian, while the other major title was The Savage Sword of Conan. Roy Thomas's runs of Conan made many valuable contributions to the character and mythology, and have a well-deserved place in fantasy history. He was to also create during this time the character of Red Sonja, who is the bikini-clad she-devil with a sword, now owned by Dynamite Comics. She was also to be written for quite some time by Roy Thomas. Though not all Conan stories are created equal, the fact that there was so much Conan shows that he did dominate the genre to a large extent. Hardly a perfect series of runs, they were nonetheless an invaluable contribution to history's finest genre. These are the major stories of the time, at least those produced for Conan. There were other great tales, such as The Last Unicorn in 1969, one which Joe holds up in high esteem as the greatest, most philosophical of all Silver Age tales, though it is overshadowed as a great deal of the Silver Age by 2 pieces of work that were to taint the whole of this age. The first that will be referred is Earthsea, a tale without a plot, a world barren of lore, history, and without any decent prose. Mere words on a page with no great meaning. The book and story were written, if one could even use that term, by Le Guin. But needless to say, Le Guin sought to subvert the boy's own tale and the notion of the energetic, if impulsive youth who sets off on the adventure only to suffer and learn wisdom, as established by the likes of Louis Alexander and others, as they had veered the genre towards following in the footsteps of Arthuriana's themes of the hero's journey as a boy's own story. The next that must be referenced that worked to subvert the genre was Elric. What Lewis did for the boy's own journey, the author of Elric Melniboné did for some adult fantasy tales. Elric's writer, interestingly though, is a more complicated man than Le Guin, and there is nuance to many of his views, many which have changed and grown over the years, so kudos to him. But for one thing, Elric was a physically weak individual who disdained his people's debauched ways as they had given into debauchery the more civilized they became, and who relied on drugs to maintain his strength. Normally you could see why a hippie would love the character, though there is a nuance into the argument of civilization versus barbarism, as there is some Conan influence here. Though given the initial physical weakness and a coming from civilization and a drug binging, it is obvious that Elric is a subversion and inversion of Conan. Does that mean all Elric stories are bad? Well, not entirely, though their cultural influence has not been exactly positive, as the inverting of themes and ideas inherent to the genre would serve to inflict a deadly wound against it, so that Elric is well and deservedly forgotten by the larger population. Though, if you're a fan of his, let us know in the comment section, as some of the tales and ideas therein, and many of those of his author, are commendable, as few men have done so much to keep Burroughs, Howard, and many other writers' memories alive than he. So he does deserve his place in fantasy history, though is Elric scrutinized and read cautiously. Thus were the seeds of the downfall of the Silver Age planted in the early 60s, and were to flower and flourish over the course of them and the 70s, encouraged by wastrel hippies who hungered to rebel against and reject the better stories of Tolkien, Howard, Disney, Dunsany, and countless others who provided healthier stories for societies at large. While all this was going on, in rural America, there was a creative game designer with a love of whimsy, fantasy, and art and gaming, who was working on a series of model games which slowly evolved into a series of supplementary guides that relied more on imagination. This man, a creative titan in his own right, was known as Gary Gygax. Gygax loved fantasy and loved imagination. It was he who planted the seeds as far back as 1974 for much of the ideas that would come to rule over the next stage of fantasy. He was to write the first Greyhawk Adventure module in 1977 after meeting with some success with his creative ideas and gaming ideas in 1974, just before his partner in crime passed, so that the sole owner of their works was Gygax, who was however devastated and slowed down by his passing. Yet as said, Gygax had soldiered on with impressive resolve and dedication, but Gygax's influence would be better felt in the next stage of fantasy, when he would become strangely infamous, if briefly so through the 80s. In the meantime, Disney had produced Sleeping Beauty, a visual masterpiece. Though its story is rather lackluster compared to other Disney projects, after this, the company had dabbled with T.H. White's Sword in the Stone, which was an animation wonder and is still rightfully touted as a masterpiece. There were other Disney works, mostly of animals and lesser works, with the next noteworthy picture of a fantasy sort being an anthropomorphic sort in the form of Robin Hood in 1973, a film that has inspired one of Joe's own works and which had some of the most finely drawn Disney characters of all times. The film, though, was not an immense success like Snow White, Cinderella, or Sword in the Stone. Disney, unfortunately, fell into squalor and difficult times, falling away in the view of Don Bluth from the path laid out by Walt. Once the 9 old men were likewise gone the way of their leader, there was only a few left, at the company with Walt's vision, with the animators led by Don Bluth leading an exodus from the studio at the end of the 70s. Don goes into all of this in his great biographical book, Somewhere Out There, My Animated Life, which you should buy for a full history of animation, fantasy, and much more, especially since there are few men who have exerted a greater influence on animation and fantasy literary history than him. Disney no longer in the game, and with studios producing a few movies, mostly of Jason and the Argonauts and Hercules, and stunning masterpieces throughout the Silver Age, movies which used Harryhausen's incredible effects, with his movies culminating in the Clash of the Titans in 1981. To an extent, it can be argued that this movie was the last real hurrah of the Silver Age, which had begun well with an explosion of writers and artists, only to have died with a whimper and increasing squabbling over properties or pay or creative vision. It is suitable that Harryhausen, who was there throughout it all, should give this era its final climax the way he did. The next stage, though, would be different. It would begin somewhere around 1980 and 1981, with this era ushering forth even more comics, novels, movies, and even stories in a new medium known as video games. Ultimately, where the Silver Age writers had striven to rebel or to otherwise chart their own course, the Bronze Age, for the most part, would seek to emulate the Golden, strangely rebel against the increasingly dull Silver Age. And now, if you have enjoyed this video, do give your thoughts in the comments section and smash that like and subscribe button if you haven't already, as though you were Conan striking down his enemies.
A knight is sworn to valor.
A knight is sworn to valor.
His heart knows only virtue.
His heart knows only virtue.
His blade defends the helpless.
His blade defends the helpless.
His might upholds the weak.
His might upholds the weak.
His word speaks only truth.
His word speaks only truth.
His wrath undoes the wicked.
His wrath undoes the wicked.
Though it did not appear in the early phase of the Bronze Age of fantasy, Dragonheart still cuts through to the heart of fantasy in this era. It is a deeply spiritual, philosophical, and somber work with the greatest fictional code of honor ever seen in all of fiction. The notion of honor, chivalry, and love were to be constant themes throughout the Bronze Age, right alongside friendship. This new age is one with a great deal more controversy, a greater number of writers, and with works of considerably greater quality for the most part to that of the Silver Age. It is also one with far more mediums for storytelling, so this will have to be divided into several categories or chapters to be able to make sense of it without confusing people too much. So to start with, we'll go with novels, as they should always come first, and out to be the marker by which fiction is judged, rather than cinema, video games, or comic books. The major works at the start of the 80s are those of David Gemmell, who believed himself to be dying due to a misdiagnosis, so that he wrote a great novel in the form of Legend. It was to launch a very successful career, one which saw David married to the ideals of the Bronze Age of fantasy, so that he was honestly the standard by which it should mostly be judged, especially in terms of the ethics and philosophical notions proposed in the stories of this era. The other great work at the outset of the 80s came out in 1982 and was Dragons of Autumn Twilight. This first of many Dragonlance novels was written by Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman, a superb team of writers who were to launch a very successful career, one which saw them guide the genre throughout the 80s and 90s, with Dragonlance doing for fantasy what Star Wars did for sci-fi as it came to be the dominant franchise of the genre. Dragonlance, under their pens, was a success, to say the very least. But this was not a series that was reserved only for the duo, but was opened up to others, such as Richard Knaak and countless other writers, who came to form and organically co-create the various ages of Krynn, with there being about 100 works published about this remarkable world. In terms of book franchises, there really is nothing quite like Dragonlance, though the Hyborian Age and Middle-earth have infinitely better written books by more famous writers. If you want something slightly more modern that works as said, like Star Wars, Dragonlance is the series for you. Around 1987, the Dragonbone chair came out and was a runaway success. It is really the greatest work of Tad Williams' long career, and it's an incredibly brilliant volume. It is really hard to compare it to any previous work of fantasy, especially those of the Bronze Age. It is the closest any book has come to the quality of writing to be found in The Lord of the Rings and Hour of the Dragon. The trouble is that the two latter books were not of the same caliber and go some way towards undermining it. After it, the Bronze Age became little more than the odd writing here and there of stories such as Forgotten Realms, Dragonlance, and of course, Gamel, amongst others. Conan, of course, appears and features with brilliant tales and had novelizations of his films, or in the case of the 90s, Kull's film. The truth is, there isn't much to comment upon, because generally, the works about Conan are fairly consistent and good, and involved a lot of reprints. The thing is, though, there was a brief period after Roy Thomas left the comic book title that things were shaken up. Conan, though, had a resurgence to glory in the Dark Horse runs of the early 2000s, though the second title was when some of the wear began to show. There was another book series worth mentioning that appeared in the early 80s and that ran through the 90s and the early 2000s that spawned a great animated series, and that was to be a game changer also. Redwall, a story of mice fighting to preserve their homes, or to make new homes in some cases. Brian Jauch's brilliant series was to match Dragonlance and combine its expansive universe with some of the boldness of early Disney, except with much more violence, of course. Overall, the Animal Fantasy series were some of the most remarkable stories to ever grace the genre and were to run through to the 2000s, outlasting most other fantasy stories and writers who had long since by that time run out of steam, in terms of the big titles and names, that is. But the decline of the Bronze Age overall for novels began to appear after the second book of Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn. The trouble was when J.K. Rowling came out with Harry Potter, a mediocre book at best, written for a young audience with the premise of Worst Witch with a few modifications. It swept to glorious success and turned Rowling into an overnight celebrity. Shortly afterwards, towards the end of the 90s, Game of Thrones was published. It had the exact same plot as Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, minus some of the interesting lore and characters, though many characters are entirely the same, and was to eventually sweep Martin to incredible popularity. The truth is, by the time of the early 2000s, most writers were losing steam. Gamel tragically passed away about that time. There were no more ardent defenders of the Bronze Age and her values. This left the way open for an endless parade of Game of Thrones and Harry Potter sequels that put the nail in the coffin for the age, so that it effectively came to an end with the passing of Gamel. Even Dragonlance by this time was losing steam, and soon fell into an unending legal battle between Wizards of the Coast and Wason Hickman, with the last book, Dragons of the Hourglass Mage, a pretty mediocre to slightly above average book, the last entry in the franchise in about 2008. That is until recently. Okay, so fantasy died in the early 2000s in terms of books. Now to examine movies. It must be said that cinematically, the situation was quite different. Good works were abundant and to be found almost everywhere. The first work people would want mentioned would be Excalibur, but as it is Arthuriana, it shouldn't be mentioned. Because as said, Arthuriana is its own genre, to a large extent one that is complex and has its own history. In truth, the first work worth mentioning at the start of the 80s came with its own novel attached to it. One that is a great read, by the way, and that was Dragon Slayer in 1981. It tells the story of a boy who sets out to slay a wicked dragon, but gets pulled into the politics of the kingdom and must figure out how best to save it, even as he has to contend with wicked kings, bloodthirsty guards, and stubborn princesses. It sounds like a classic tale, but what was new was the melancholic and dark tone to the whole film, along with the endless squabbling of the colorful cast of characters. The next hit was Conan the Barbarian. It was this movie that set the tone for sword and sorcery for the next 15 years. This movie was one of the biggest hits of its time. Well written, well acted, and thought-provoking. It remains true to the spirit of the Conan tales in spite of lore inaccuracies up the wazoo, so to speak. In animation, the big hit was The Secret of Nim, an animation film by Don Bluth that was full of emotional gut punches, fantastic visual effects, and superb writing. It is one of the all-time greatest movies of all times. That was to take the world by storm and open doors for the greatest indie animation studio of all times. Disney tried to counter Secret of NIMH with their long-planned Black Cauldron movie, but it completely missed the mark. Somehow butchered the Bredane lore, and though the Horned King had enormous presence, it failed to make use of him. The movie was a flop. Though it has become a cult classic since then due to some admittedly decent animation and voice acting on the parts of some of the cast. In the video game sphere, Blue followed up NIMH with the immensely popular game Dragon's Lair, which spawned one sequel and an attempt to make a film. But ultimately this was not successful, sadly. But Dragon's Lair was a hugely popular game and is a classic save the princess tale with a great deal of humor and the usual heart that Don always pours into everything he does. While Don Bluth was to release such hits as All Dogs Go to Heaven and a myriad of other great classics, ones that many treasure to this day, Disney's leaders were watching and learning. In 1989, they released The Little Mermaid, and this began what is popularly known as the Disney Renaissance. Classics such as Beauty and the Beast, Lion King, Aladdin, Pocahontas, Mulan, Tarzan, and many others were produced in this era, with the era arguably stretching well into the early 2000s, and ending with Brother Bear and Treasure Planet, though the latter is sci-fi rather than fantasy. In all, for animation, this was a new golden age, one that merits all the praise and cheers it gets. Not to be outdone, Don Bluth, once his studio was bought by Fox, was to create Anastasia, a Russian fantasy story that could go toe-to-toe with any of Disney's superb movies. He was to take a stab at sci-fi under pressure from Fox, which proved a mistake as it wasn't a commercial success. After this, Bluth's studio was shut down, even as DreamWorks put out several great projects, but were ultimately beaten by Disney. Honorable mention for this era should also go to Thumbelina, another Bluth film that he poured considerable heart into. Seriously, it is criminally underrated and quite fun, just as Aladdin King of Thieves, Mulan, and the Goofy movie are. As to live action, the 80s saw diminishing returns in terms for Sword and Sorcery in comparison to the early 80s, with it being near the end of them that Princess Bride stormed its way to theaters. A great film, one that has considerable heart to it, and a great deal of humor. It was something of a one-off story, and one that was cinematically akin to Hobbit, in how it was geared towards children and involved simple, good-natured fun. Before it, Lady Hawk had appeared in '85, and had sought to follow more in the footsteps of Dragon Slayer than Conan, but the peculiar soundtrack and some minor issues had left Lady Hawk much more of an acquired taste and cult classic, one still worth checking out. Another TV series that dominated, though, was a rather more comedic series in the shape of Melissa Joan Hart's incredible Sabrina the Teenage Witch, a fantastic series about balancing everyday life with magical powers. Thus, fantasy had made the successful transition not only to a new generation of animated films, but also to televised series. In terms of miniseries, there were such epics as Merlin, though that's our Fairyana, The Snow Queen, and of course the epic 10th Kingdom, all by Hallmark, who produced some high-quality, well-written, and deeply moving fantasy tales that have in some ways never been topped ever since they came out. Fingers crossed that they return to form someday. The movie scene was rather different. There were some movies to be sure, but none shone quite so brightly or greatly as Dragonheart. It is in Dragonheart that one finds the most moving, the most philosophical of the 90s fantasy movie experiences. A movie about a dragon-slaying knight who finds friendship and a mentor in The Last Dragon Alive, only to then embark on a quest to overthrow a tyrannical king. Dragonheart is no less philosophical and melancholic in some ways than Conan from 1982. The movie dares to ask questions about masculinity, chivalry, and also our place in the universe and the nature of right and wrong. It also brings up the issues of legacy and friendship and love of all sorts, such as that between friends, brothers, and of course, man and woman. Arguably, it is one of the last cinematic experiences for fantasy that has a philosophical side to it. As sadly, most movie producers would prefer to take fantasy in a different direction. Kull the Conqueror followed after Dragonheart and was not the big success that was hoped for, despite it being a fairly fun movie. It would not be until about 2000 before a major fantasy movie was to come out. That movie was the Peter Jackson interpretation of the first part of Tolkien's classic Lord of the Rings novel. The movie was immensely successful and spawned 2 sequels, this much to the chagrin of Christopher Tolkien, who did not much like the movies and felt that they had not been accurate to his father's epic works. The Jackson movies were to inspire the last real hoorah of live-action movies in the form of the greatest adaptations of the Chronicles of Narnia. There isn't enough praise heaped on this trilogy. Where the novels were mediocre at best, the movies elevated the stories, introduced more nuance to the characters, and were big blockbuster set pieces that followed in the footsteps of Jackson, while also proving themselves to be very different, as Andrew Adamson was a very different director. He directed the first 2 Narnia movies. There was another movie series that was produced in the age of Jackson and Narnia, though. In the late 90s, Harry Potter came out and was a worldwide phenomena, supported by every big publishing chain. It could not fail. Harry Potter mania was everywhere in the Anglosphere, and even in other places. And this meant a movie was inevitable. One was made, was a success, and so for several years there was an unending wave of Harry Potter movies starring Daniel Radcliffe. While Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, and Narnia dominated the live-action sphere, the animation one was undergoing a lot of changes. 2D was forsaken, needlessly, after the runaway success of Shrek. A hilarious story, one with a great deal of heart, Shrek was a spoof of Disney classics. Certainly, 2D animation did not at once die, but it was Shrek that spelt the beginning of the end, and was to take the hype for 3D started by Toy Story and bring it up to a whole new level. Shrek 2 followed and was a perfect sequel. Fun, hilarious, and with even more heart, if that's possible, than the original. It was a fairy tale that has no real flaws in terms of the art or the writing, with the only serious criticism one could level at it being that it spawned sequels of its own and facilitated the death of 2D animation. 2D animation was to perish after The Princess and the Frog, the last-ditch effort to salvage the 2D animators department over at Disney, and was followed by the hilarious Tangled. While Tangled was a great story, it was, however, the last classic styled in terms of writing Disney princess stories. And though it was something of a spoof and had flaws, it and The Voyage of the Dawn Treader signified the end for the Bronze Age of cinematic fantasy. Okay, movie's done. Now to discuss video games, before we get to the downfall of the Bronze Age. Video games initially weren't too complex. They didn't tell grandiose stories like the then superior mediums that are cinema and novels. That all began to change with the masterpiece of Dragon's Lair, which showed that great things could be done with video games. The thing, though, is that it was not America that was to produce the first big titles in the fantasy genre for this new storytelling medium. At the start, Final Fantasy was the last-ditch effort by Squaresoft to turn a profit. The game barely had a story, but it jump-started a new game franchise. Final Fantasy came out in the late 80s and was immediately followed over the next few decades by more sequels than Iron Man the movie. A truly great game. It cannot be overstated enough just how this thing revolutionized turn-based video games, with its sequels doing much the same. The series, though, did morph eventually, though, as much into a weird steampunk fantasy genre story with the 6th iteration of the series, with this trend continuing until number 10, which was a post-apocalyptic story, which, while gripping, hardly feels like fantasy. A peculiar series, this is nonetheless one worth mentioning. Another great game that came out of Japan at this time, this one out of the now popular video game studio Nintendo, The Legend of Zelda. The first 2 games didn't have much story to them, but proved popular enough to inspire a TV series, and the third game in the franchise, A Link to the Past. It was A Link to the Past that was when the lore was at last put together and was a game changer. After this, most Zelda games had a focus on a balance of great gameplay, dungeoneering, fantastic lore, and interesting characterization. The series was to blaze the way forward, and is arguably the video game answer to Sword and Sorcery to an extent, though not blatantly. It is also deep, beautiful, and very Celtic, even as it is very much influenced by Japanese philosophy and literature, which only adds to the appeal. In the West, there were few to contend with the Japanese dominance of the genre, which they did in the form of FF, Zelda, Breath of Fire, and countless other great titles. But one studio full of indie creatives dared to try to defy them. A real-time strategy game studio, they were to create Warcraft. The game came out in the same year as the first of the movies of Hercules: The Legendary Journeys, 1994. It was at first a fairly simple game with little lore attached to it. Warcraft 2 continued the franchise and began to introduce some lore, with there being various comics and books and book adaptations used to further develop the tales surrounding Warcraft 1 and 2. The third game in the franchise came out around 2003 and was a smash hit, the sort that turned the genre on its head, so that on its own it could well have been one of the biggest games in RTS history, let alone gaming and fantasy history. But Blizzard and the remarkable Chris Metzen weren't finished, not by a mile. Warcraft 3 was but the beginning, as they launched one of the biggest games, possibly the biggest, in human history, World of Warcraft. WoW, in its early iteration, was magnificent. It is hard to describe to someone who came in after the era of the Wrath of the Lich King. Early on, something more than a community, more than simply a game. It was an experience all to itself. The game was not only fun, but everyone, or almost everyone in it, felt part of a fellowship. In some places of the game, it still feels that way. And much of that is thanks to the people who stayed on and those YouTubers and serious devotees to it, such as Asmongold, who were there at the beginning or near to it and have devoted themselves to keeping the memory of those early days alive, in spite of Blizzard's best efforts to destroy itself. On the Japanese end of things, while Kingdom Hearts kept Disney alive, at least in spirit, and fantasy alive for a time, with the advent of Kingdom Hearts 2 that closed every possible storyline in a neat little bow and ended the series perfectly. The series should have ended in 2008. The problem was, it kept plowing ahead. Obviously for financial reasons, rather than any legitimate thematic ones. But in 2008, fantasy gaming took a nosedive after Kingdom Hearts 2 ended the story. Most fantasy games that followed did not have the massive impact that Kingdom Hearts, Warcraft, or many other 90s and early 2000s stories did. There were great games that followed, but in fantasy none matched these ones, save for the odd release from Zelda, which may as well have ended its main line of games with Skyward Sword, and its side titles with Hyrule Warriors. Both excellent stories and gaming experiences, though the latter was slightly controversial. It is now that our story must turn away from the Bronze Age, an era that began in 1981 thereabouts, and that had plowed on ahead until 2010 or thereabouts. It was about this time that seeds planted in earlier decades bore poisonous fruit. Subversion began to kick in. While Nintendo had, for example, created Fire Emblem to honor traditional stories, the series turned to nonsensical, subversive stories, and trying to defy the earlier trends. You see, this is an example of what happened everywhere, and shows that everyone began wanting to subvert and deconstruct, both terms for destroy or upend. The main stories that served to destroy fantasy were Harry Potter and Game of Thrones, or A Song of Ice and Fire as it's also called. Both stories boasted vast sprawling universes, were immensely popular, and were proud to upend earlier trends, to take pot shots at expectations, thinking that it is the end, not so much the journey, that makes a fantasy story. While the pros could be good in both stories, in the case of Harry Potter, for example, Rowling used the first 4 books as setup, only to then devote the last books to subverting the earlier ones, killing off characters needlessly, turning villains into tragic figures, and otherwise trying to make villains deeper, which is always the cry of the bad writers of the subversive variety, that by making heroes behave more atrociously and villains seem pitiable and self-pitying, that they are adding depth. The goal is to ensure that you can't tell them apart, and that you see in shades of gray, as they will often say, rather than black and white, when they themselves see things only in shades of black and white. It is just that they've flipped black to white and white to black, so to speak. What is evil is good, and what is good is evil. It is this postmodernist nonsense that the genre has always stood against, as the genre has always been one devoted to pre-modern, traditional values, if one pays attention to the greats. The trouble is that Rowling and Martin have totally destroyed these ideas. One need only watch any episode of Game of Thrones or read any of the books to see this. The first book in this case is to set up, and then the later ones are to deconstruct. This in spite of his borrowing, as they say, the plot of Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, with his world admittedly well created, just as that of Ostenard was. The difficulty lies in that from the death of Ned Stark, rather than launching into a tale of heroism and sacrifice, Martin seeks to undermine the notions of heroism, of valor, of honor, and goodness. He throws himself into one of perversion, cruelty, and savagery without any good. He despises good. Martin, it must be said, is a postmodernist, just as Rowling is. No amount of differing or splitting hairs will change that. This may not be a popular or well-liked statement, but it must be said. The victory and triumph of Rowling and Martin, and their dictating the tone, themes, or lack thereof, and the subversive ideas to the rest of fantasy, was to destroy it, so that we who love fantasy live in the post-fantasy era, so to speak, or in a dark age of fantasy. Though some channels and places have begun to see some call for an Iron Age of fantasy, call for a new age, one with far more in common with the Bronze and Golden Ages, to which, it must be said, by we, the brothers Kryn, fantasy writers do not despair. The genre was indeed destroyed for a time. Iron Ages might be lesser than Bronze and Golden ones, or even Silver ones. But remember, the name ascribed to the Iron Age civilizations long after their empires have faded, the Classical Age. With enough effort, the Iron may transform into the heroic or the classical, so that this is the age of those who truly love the genre, not those who hate it, as Martin and Rowling do. Let the big corporations destroy Lord of the Rings with Rings of Power. Let Wheel of Time be destroyed by those who envy Robert Jordan. And let them tear down Harry Potter and Game of Thrones as much as they like. As fast as they can destroy, we can rebuild. We can also build longer and better than they can destroy. The forces of cultural poison cannot create, cannot build anything lasting, as Yoda remarks in the Star Wars Episode 3 novel, because what they build is built on hate and rage. What we intend to build, we fantasy writers, is an age of new works. We also intend to honor what came before, to honor Tolkien. For Lord of the Rings cannot be truly brought down by Rings of Power and Amazon. And you know why? Because Howard, Disney, Bluth, Dunsany, Robert Jordan, and all the rest, and all the others built things which we love. And so long as one man still reads and watches their works still live. So long as there are Brandon Sandersons and thousands of individual indies working and toiling at their universes, there is hope. Hope of new worlds, new universes, new mythologies left undiscovered that will eventually see the light of day. So keep hope. Keep to the old code of chivalry. And tonight, as you read, hold your favorite writers in your heart. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to smash that like and subscribe button, as though you were Huma, the messianic knight of Dragonlance, putting an end to the subversive, destructive Queen of Evil, Takhisis.